So the term narcissism is something of a hot topic these days. And it makes sense. It's a fairly prevalent social disorder, and many people are on the receiving end of this disorder. Many of the people who are on the receiving end of this disorder happen to be a kind of narcissist themselves, because narcissism ultimately stems from a deep sense of insecurity about your ability to control your world. If you're being manipulated by a narcissist, it follows that you are going to lose that kind of sense of control. As soon as you start identifying as a victim, then suddenly you take measures so oftentimes in order to reacquire a sense of control. And oftentimes this will be at the expense of other people. But the thing about narcissism is, as soon as you have this disorder, you tend not to identify with the term narcissist. You'll watch videos online about narcissism, and then the immediate thought that comes into your head is, I've been a victim of a narcissist, rather than my narcissistic behaviour is negatively affecting the people around me. So oftentimes narcissism is a catch-22, because narcissism, being on the receiving end of narcissism, tends to lead to you yourself possessing narcissistic traits. Yes, this is something no narcissist wants to hear, but it's the truth. Most narcissists are themselves victims of narcissists. Does this mean you as a kind, loving individual should just take pity on all narcissists and try to fix them? No, because this situation creates that toxic relationship that so many people end up being damaged by, and then taking a test on the internet, receiving an INFJ code, because that's the behaviour they tend to exhibit as a result of this manipulation, and then identifying as an INFJ, take the comment sections online and then saying, I'm an INFJ because I've been manipulated by a narcissist. Yeah, this is something that actually happens. It's weird, but it makes sense. People's behaviour can be changed by being in a toxic relationship with an individual who probably beforehand was themselves in a toxic relationship. It's a vicious cycle. People manipulate other people. The people who are manipulated by other people feel a lack of control over their lives and feel deeply insecure. And then they start forming a myriad of different self-defense mechanisms in order to reacquire that sense of control. But I digress. The major negative ramification of personality typing is that it can create a very unhealthy mindset whereby everything has to be forced into these neat little categories. Everything has to be put into this kind of binary system whereby certain types are more likely to manifest a disorder than other types. Certain types are more likely to be the victims of a certain behavioural disorder than other types. And narcissism is no exception. There is this kind of consensus going around at the moment that types such as the INFJ, INFP are more likely to be the victim of, say, a narcissist, which is apparently, according to popular opinion, more likely to manifest in people such as the ENTP and the ENTJ. Well, what if I told you this isn't actually strictly untrue, in the sense that, in behavioural terms, the ENTJ and the ENTP are more likely to exhibit a certain kind of narcissism, a certain unsubtle kind so often. But to say that these types are more likely to be themselves narcissists, to suffer from the actual mental disorder of that deep sense of insecurity and that need to make up for your own lack of control through the manipulation of other people, is fundamentally untrue. I would say no type is more likely to be a narcissist than another one. And you get some absolutely absurd claims going around at the moment that sort of says INFPs and INFJs, for example, are supposed to be some kind of saints, this kind of saviour complex individual who just wants to help everybody and can never ever act in a way which is purely and intrinsically selfish. This is absolute nonsense. INFJs and INFPs can be narcissists just as much as ENTPs and ENTJs, but the manner in which this narcissism displays itself might be, for example, easier for other people to cope with. That doesn't mean they're not narcissists. It just means the behaviour they're exhibiting to those who perhaps don't know them that well doesn't carry with it this comic book style villain archetype than the behaviour of someone who, say, is more extroverted might. And the ways in which narcissism might express itself does actually correlate quite strongly with the nature of a person's introverted feeling in their respective cognitive stack. And I could subdivide ad infinitum, but the more we subdivide, the less we can account and adapt to the myriad of exceptions that exist within any particular paradigm. So sure, I could say an INFJ has a specific form of narcissism, but then I could say a TI-emphasized INFJ might have a different form of narcissism than an INFJ who dips more frequently into a conscious introverted feeling. There we go, we have another subdivision. But the problem of such subdivisions is the fact that it fails to recognize and account for the fact that everything is on a spectrum, everything is on a continuum. For example, a narcissistic ISFP might manifest narcissism in a particular way, but that doesn't mean 20% of the time they aren't going to manifest narcissism in a more ENTJ-like manner, and vice versa. And the more we subdivide, the harder it is to account for the fluidity in which a person can express certain kind of behavioural traits. And so with that in mind, I'm not going to subdivide a form of narcissism into each of the 16 types, or into 32 different subtypes, or into 64 different variations. No. For the sake of this video, I'm going to be simplifying narcissism into 2 different manifestations. Because let's be honest, within this particular community of ours, this personality typing community, a certain form of narcissism tends to get the spotlight, while a more passive, clandestine form of narcissism tends to very much evade the spotlight. Even to such an extent as to say, when people look at this form of narcissism, they say, oh no, this is just a victim of a narcissist. The victim of a narcissist can't possibly be a narcissist because this is on the other end of a continuum. Failing to recognise that, to be honest, opposing ends of a continuum always dip into one another anyway. So first of all, let's explore this standard, default, most stereotypical form of narcissism. This individual who has this kind of God complex, who goes around manipulating other people because they feel an innate desire to actively control their world. Rather than feeling like things happen to them, this individual feels like things happen as a result of their actions, and therefore their sense of self-worth comes from the effect they can render in reality. This is a divergent feeler. Within CPT, there are 2 forms of a function's expressing. These are the attitudes. You have convergence, whereby a function is under active control, and you have divergence, whereby the function is not under active control and therefore is very much an authority pushing forward the agenda of the dominant stack. A form of narcissism hailing from a introverted feeling authority or oppositional function paradigm, divergent as it is a form of narcissism which is very active, which seeks to control forcefully the world around it, that adopts various strategies in order to bend other people to its will. Now, the thing about narcissism is it's on a spectrum. Some people have a little bit, some people have a lot. Yeah, okay, there are certain people with introverted feeling in the divergent position, whether it's conscious or unconscious, such as, INFJ, unconscious introverted feeling, ENTJ, conscious divergent introverted feeling. But both of these types have the capacity, the divergent introverted feeling capacity, to see the world as subject to their own whims. And the form of narcissism based upon this divergent introverted feeling does actually vary according to whether the introverted feeling is in the oppositional position, such as an INTP, ENTJ, or in the authority position, the divergent auxiliary, such as the INFJ, the ENFP. The oppositional function tends to have more of a kind of utility narcissism. These are the things I am doing and therefore I deserve to be compensated. Whereas the divergent auxiliary position narcissism tends to manifest as more of a kind of entitlement from a sense of self-worth, a more intrinsic sense of value that doesn't necessarily need to be backed up by one's own sense of utility. Please get it out of your head that INFJs cannot be narcissists, because this will trip you up. This will lower your defenses. Just because someone is being pleasant in the moment with their extrovert feeling authority does not mean they do not possess this innate sense of entitlement, does not mean that the world to them is not their playground. And I'd also say the INFJs who do suffer from narcissism are unlikely to receive an INFJ result from a test. So yeah, people who you might think are an ENTJ might actually be INFJs. It depends how well you know the cognitive functions. Because ENTJs can be absolutely lovely and empathetic individuals, absent any serious degree of narcissistic personality disorder. So to summarize this particular form, the divergent introverted feeling narcissism, whether it's a conscious introverted feeling such as ENFP or an unconscious one such as say an ISTP, manifests in a sense of entitlement, manifests in a incredibly strong belief in a person's ability to affect their world. If this individual is feeling very insecure in their ability to affect the world, they will act, they will create strategies, they will create frameworks in order to effectively raise their standing within any given social situation, oftentimes at the expense of another person. But before I move on to convergent narcissism, I do want to mention that just because you are not exhibiting narcissistic traits does not mean you are not a narcissist. Just because an INFJ or an ISTP is abiding by a social environment does not mean they do not possess that deep sense of insecurity, that deep absence of the perception, the locus of control within their own mind. And it is this feeling, this absence of control, and a desire to construct various delusions or social frameworks in order to effectively acquire the affirmation necessary to make up for one's own perception of a lack of control. That is at the core of a narcissistic personality disorder. Just because you're not obviously manipulating other people, just because you're not obviously conforming to this sociopathic villain archetype, does not mean you do not suffer from a very serious case of narcissism. And this leads me perfectly to convergent narcissism, because this is a form of narcissism, this is a form of introverted feeling, whereby instead of you causing action unto the world, the actions of the world happen to you. Within the dominant introverted feeling position, whether it's an ENFJ or an INFP, for example, this manifests as the victim complex variant of narcissism, whereby things happen to you, you rack up a scoreboard, you feel like a victim, and then suddenly the world owes you. And before you know it, you've developed this pathology whereby your own pain, your own wounds are used as emotional leverage to get other people to do what you want, to get other people to treat you in a way that you want to be treated. You see, if you're going around saying, I'm the victim of this, I'm the victim of that, these things have happened to me, I want life to give me a break, I want other people to respect my wounded soul, I want other people to tiptoe around me. And so oftentimes I want other people to exist in the same emotional pit that I do in order to make me feel better. In what way is this not narcissism? In what way is this not, from a deep sense of insecurity and lack of control, a manipulative strategy in order to make yourself feel better about your own absence of control at the expense of other people's life experience? This is narcissism. And yet it is a narcissism that seems to be highly overlooked, especially within this community, because apparently all narcissists are ENTPs and ENTJs and all victims are INFPs and INFJs. Yeah, that's nonsense. If you are using your own emotional pain in order to blackmail other people, if you are using this tally board that you've been creating against, say, your partner, in order to get the other person to do what you want, this is manipulation. This is using your own suffering in order to control other people, in order to play on another person's conscience, sufficiently as to leverage them into doing what you want them to do. So yeah, convergent feeling can occupy a narcissistic personality disorder just as much as divergent feeling. And this victim complex form of narcissism very much seems to occupy the more dominant inverted feeling position. And yeah, if you lean more towards a convergent or auxiliary position, it's less of a victim complex and more of a kind of pride complex. Rather than identifying as a victim, this convergent feeling individual who has life happen to them, be it an ENTP, INTJ, etc., will instead develop a kind of pride as a self-defense mechanism, a kind of confirmation bias so often, because suddenly they have to be right. Things happen to them, bad things happen to them, not because they were a victim, but rather because people just don't understand them, because people just don't get them, because they are morally superior, because they are just so much more intelligent than everybody else. This is the pride form of narcissism. And so oftentimes it's not this kind of stereotypical bashing people over the head with this manipulative hammer archetype that so many people seem to identify as the sole form of narcissism, but rather a much more passive-aggressive form of narcissism, perhaps the most passive-aggressive out of these four forms I've addressed so far. Because this person in their own confirmation bias tends only to mix with people who agree with them, tends to actively shun people who disagree with them, tends to actively shun people and reject people before they feel the other person can reject them. And it so often tends to manifest as a kind of a cold shoulder. I'm too good for the people, I'm too good for the world. But ultimately it stems from, again, a deep sense of loss, a deep sense of a lack of control, a lack of affirmation from the world around you, a feeling of isolation. And pride very much rises to the surface as a defense mechanism. And in many, many ways, this convergent auxiliary introverted feeling narcissist, whether it's an ESTP, an ISTJ, etc., tends to go far more under the radar than other forms, because it's not a form of narcissism that tends to directly hurt and manipulate other people. Because the method of control enacted by this particular form of narcissism is much more passive-aggressive in nature. Control is exerted through controlled rejection, through the repeated assertion that this life that happens to you is obviously just not good enough for your own supremacy. And in so many ways, this is the most lonely form of narcissism, because it is control and manipulation through voluntary isolation, voluntary rejection of other people. And so instead of having this overly fictitious, demonic villain construct exerting this kind of Machiavellian influence over other people in order to get what they want without any feeling of remorse or guilt, we actually have 4 distinct variations. And all of these variations are deeply unhappy people with so oftentimes a highly conscious sense of their own lack of control over their lives. And you have to wonder, who's the victim here? The person who is pushing everyone away from them constantly? Or the person who might happen to hang around with a few narcissists every now and again? Because one person seems to be dwelling in this pit of perpetual isolation, whereas this other person has this huge community they can flock to after an hour's interaction with the narcissist and then start complaining about how narcissists are the bane of society without really thinking about what caused that person to be a narcissist in the first place. And the apparent victim of these narcissists who is flocking to these comment boards, these forums, these communities in order to belittle the people who have been, causing them a fair amount of emotional distress, are so oftentimes very slowly acquiring a sense of narcissism themselves, acquiring this kind of sense of loss and developing behavioural traits that seek to affect the world around them or adapt to the world around them, such as in a convergent feeling position, in order to enhance their own sense of self-esteem, in order to perhaps even delude the individual into thinking they have more control over their lives than they actually do. So to summarise, let's work from dominant position to oppositional position. The hyperconvergent dominant position variant of narcissism will manifest as a kind of victim complex. Life happens to this person marks up a scoring board to say how much other people owe them, how much life owes them for all this pain that they've been dealt. Then this person exerts emotional leverage onto other people in order to essentially guilt trip the other person into doing what they want, guilt trip the other person into dwelling so oftentimes within the same kind of darkness as this particular individual. Next up, we have the convergent auxiliary introverted feeling narcissism. This so often manifests as a kind of pride. Life still happens to you, but this is because life is obviously just not good enough for you. You are obviously a superior human being, and therefore you'll push away anyone who says otherwise and develop this kind of confirmation bias whereby everything that happens has to back up your own particular worldview and ultimately your sense of innate worth. And the more you can reject reality, the more you can construct your own isolation, the more empowered you feel as a result. And in terms of manipulation, this will be pushing away other people who disagree with you. This will be throwing tantrums whenever somebody seems to be questioning your own intelligence. And it will be using your voluntary isolation in order to leverage other people into doing what you want and continuing to feed your sense of pride. Next up, we have the divergent auxiliary, the introverted feeling authority position of narcissism. So instead of life happening to you, life happens as a result of your actions. And this form of narcissist tends to have a form of God complex. They have an innate sense of self-worth. And therefore, the things that happen around them have to back up this sense of innate value. They have to influence the situation. They have to be seen as the most valuable player in so many situations. And this person has to receive a constant stream of affirmation from other people in order to inform their own self-worth, in order to continue backing up what is so oftentimes a delusion of one's own potential. And so oftentimes, especially in the more unconscious introverted feeling positions such as the INFJ, the potential alone is enough. You don't necessarily have to act into reality. Rather, you just have to believe you have the ability to change the world if you wanted to. And so long as people can continue to back up that particular delusion, for as long as people can prop up your confidence in this innate sense of mastery over life, the more you can stand to be around them. And then finally, the hyperdivergence of the oppositional function variant of narcissism tends to be the most actively manipulative because it is built around a utility, built around the ability to affect the world around you. Much like the God complex variant, the utility variant of narcissism still needs a constant stream of affirmation from other people. But so oftentimes this affirmation has to be a result and directly linked to the person's own actions. And therefore there's a very active form of narcissism. This is a less delusional, perhaps, form of narcissism because it's so intrinsically connected to what a person can do. But the person doesn't have to necessarily do something well. All they need to do is convince other people that they have done it as well as they want it to have been perceived to be done. I have done this, and therefore I am entitled to be rewarded. And yeah, you might notice a certain similarity with the victim complex. This is because all of these forms of narcissism can actually rotate with one another. The victim complex narcissism can rotate with the utility narcissism, and therefore both of these variants on this continuum tend to use a scoring board, a tally system, in order to rack up points against other people that they can use as leverage in order to get the other person to do what they want. Similarly, the pride variant and the God complex variant tend to overlap a bit. The pride variant, because they feel this innate sense of self-value, can also feel their innate sense of self-value gives them the ability to control the world in the way they want to. And similarly, that God complex form of narcissism in that divergent auxiliary position can feel such a strong sense of innate self-worth that they can manifest a more pride form of narcissism whereby they seek to reject everyone around them in order to continually feed this delusion of one's own innate self-worth. And in this instance, the person may act less and reject more. And just like type as posited by CBT, everything is on a spectrum. All functions can dip into one another, and therefore all forms of narcissism can be expressed in absolutely anybody. No one is exempt from narcissism. This is a prevalent human condition. A lot of people, I'm not going to say everyone, but a lot of people have at least some form of narcissism, because a lot of people feel this perpetual absence of control. And it is this incredibly small locus of control that feeds a narcissistic personality disorder. Because so oftentimes, narcissism is simply a self-defense mechanism against a loss of control. And at least on some level, in regards to at least some functions, whether it's an introverted function or an extroverted one, an extrovert perception or an introvert perception of reality, we will all be trying to make up for a lack of control. We will always fear a loss of control over our world. And therefore, narcissism is always going to be on the edge of the everyday human existence. And simplifying narcissism into this kind of either you are, either you aren't, overly relying on archetypes of a kind of exaggerated villain as the only possible manifestation of narcissism makes us blind to narcissism manifesting within ourselves, because it begins very slowly, and before we know it, it's gotten out of control and we're blind to our own disorder. So to anyone who has been the victims of narcissists, well, my heart goes out to you. It sucks. But oftentimes it is far worse to be a narcissist yourself. So in your pursuit of meaning, in your pursuit of understanding what narcissism is in the first place, don't rely overly on simplistic stereotypes. Because more than anything, you want to prevent you yourself from turning into that which you hate. So that was a brief overview of how narcissism can manifest in differing personality types, and also an introduction to the ways in which narcissism is a much more fluid entity, fluid condition than people tend to perceive it as. It can manifest in a myriad of different ways, and just because somebody isn't this evil Machiavellian sociopath doesn't mean they're not a narcissist. And just because a person's a sociopath doesn't mean they automatically are a narcissist. So especially to those of you who've made it this far into the video, thank you so much for watching. I hope it's been informative. And if you have any requests for future topics, definitely let me know what they are down below in the comments as well. Definitely like the video and share it with anyone who you think might benefit from this particular perspective. And if you haven't already done so, make sure to click that subscribe button with the bell icon next to it to stay notified of future content. I upload at least one video every single week, so I'll be back same place, same time next week. For now, take care.